Yeah, that was the premiere of Exodusters, Black Cowboys, and Buffalo Soldiers. If you're catching this live stream later, I'm going to cut that portion of the live stream out and I'll upload it separately. And this is just going to be the Q&A and live stream portion of the video. There's also an interesting video that I'll link to in the comments that goes a little bit deeper into the notion of manifest destiny. And it's called Savage Acts, Wars, Fairs, and Empire, and it addresses African Americans and their dilemma of participating in the Philippine War, a war in which, again, it was openly premised on white supremacy, the idea that we had to conquer these Filipinos to save them. And a lot of Black folks were confronting that, saying, well, wait a minute, where have I heard this before, right? So I'll link to that link a little bit later in the description, as well as a link to the premiere that you just saw on Exodusters, Black Cowboys, and Buffalo Soldiers. So I just want to go into a bit of a presentation. One of the things I wanted to highlight here is that it's easy, and I'm guilty of this, it's easy to sit back and look at the choices of the Buffalo Soldiers, for example, who were without question on the wrong side of a war that was premised on white supremacy. It's easy to look back at those choices and say, nah, I wouldn't get involved in that. I wouldn't sell out to the government like that. I mean, you might still say that, but before you say that, let's take a closer look at what their options were. So, because, my frustration has been, every Black History Month, we tend to bring out the Buffalo Soldiers out to these parades uncritically without examining the actual role they played in marching under a banner of white supremacy. But at the same time, I'm not necessarily wanting to condemn them because I get it. When stacked against what their options were, I can see how that would be a viable option. So you have to understand that before condemning them. But I still think that that's something we have to be real about. And so I wanted to start off putting you in their shoes. And so I'm going to start with Booker T. Washington. And this is an excerpt from his book, Up From Slavery. I went into more detail on this in a previous video, and I'll link to that one as well. But these are the words of Booker T. Washington reflecting back when he was 9 years old. And he was told, he was born a slave. And at this particular moment that he's writing about, he's 9 years old and he's told, hey, you're free. And this is his recollection of that moment. He wrote, for some minutes there was great rejoicing and thanksgiving and wild scenes of ecstasy. I noticed that by the time they returned to their cabins, there was a change in their feelings. The great responsibility of being free, of having charge of themselves, of having to think and plan for themselves and their children seemed them. It was very much like suddenly turning a youth of 10 or 12 years out to the world to provide for himself. In a few hours, the great questions with which the Anglo-Saxon race had been grappling for centuries had been thrown upon these people to be solved. These were the questions of home, a living, the rearing of children, education, citizenship, and the establishment and support of. Was it any wonder that within a few hours the wild rejoicing ceased and a feeling of deep gloom seemed to pervade the slave quarters? To some, now they were in actual possession of it, freedom was a more serious thing than they had expected to find. Some of the slaves were 70 or 80 years old. Their best days were gone. They had no strength with which to earn a living in a strange place and among strange people. To this class, the problem seemed especially hard. So, what can we gather about the experience of newly from this excerpt? This idea that why don't we just all go out west? So some of these slaves are 70 or 80 years old, and they're told, okay, you're free, go make a life for yourself. And Booker T. Washington kind of gives an indication of how complicated that was in terms of just, especially if your plan is to go out west, as we'll see, as we saw in the video. That's not the place to go if you're 70 or 80 years old, especially also on the cattle drives. This is arduous work, and so folks needed to take that into account in assessing what their options were. Now, Booker T. Washington's sort of way of dealing with that was to work on the situation in the South. He wasn't necessarily he wasn't opposed to it, but he wasn't necessarily in favor of black folks heading out west. One of his speeches, he said, cast your bucket down where you are. But he was similar in a sense to that ideology, and I'll go into more of the ideology in upcoming videos between Booker T. Washington and W.E.B. Du Bois. They clashed over how black folks should address this problem of, okay, now you're free. What do you do to make this freedom meaningful? But his idea was, not so much worried about Jim Crow, not so much worried about segregation, not so much worried about voting rights. His idea was, let's just build up our communities, and white folks, you can just leave us alone. We're not trying to get into your schools. We're not trying to get into your lunch counters. We're not trying to integrate, right? We'll build our lunch counters. We'll build our own schools. Just was kind of his ideology. Whereas we'll get to Du Bois' philosophy, and that's where the Buffalo Soldiers kind of come in. But this is what they're confronted with in the South. This was the idea of what emancipation meant in the imaginations of white Southerners, right? It was black folks running amok. It was black folks, out to get your children. This was an actual clipping from a newspaper in North Carolina, where the Wilmington massacre took place. The caption, I don't know if you can read it, but it says the vampire that hovers over North Carolina, right? And this is what the imagine of white folks and what emancipation meant to them. And this is the kind of fear mongering that took place that served as the underpinnings of white supremacy and some of the violence that a lot of the violence that black folks experience. It's always interesting because, from a counseling perspective, we call this, right? It's like, why do you think that black folks would just run amok like that if left to their own devices? What would give you that idea? And so, and especially, it becomes especially prevalent or apparent when we look at this idea in the white imagination at the time that, black folks, the moment they're set free, the first thing they're going to do is find a white woman to sexually assault. I always wonder, is that, why would you think that? Is that because of where you were spending your nights in the slave quarters? Is that what's going on here? Is this projection that's going on? But nevertheless, this is what sort of the underpinning of what that white supremacy was, and why folks, in addition to the lynchings, in addition to the Jim Crow, in addition to the black codes, which subjected black folks to prison convict labor for the most just trivial. If that wasn't enough, outright violence and terror was what ensued. So black folks, if they could, a lot of them sought opportunity away from that. It was a real option for a lot of folks. It was hard living. And the other thing that I didn't touch in the video, in the premiere, was your first challenge is, how are you going to get there, right? How are you going to even physically get from the deep South to Kansas? Because for a lot of these folks, these are sharecroppers. And if you remember from a previous video, we talked about this revolving debt that these sharecropping plantation owners, deliberately kept these black folks into, where their expenses never covered their debts for that year. So, if you bounce on that debt, you would be hunted down as would a fugitive slave. I mean, the people who I've read some of the accounts of folks who were leaving for Nicodemus, and they left in the dead of the night. They left. They basically had into the woods. I mean, these folks who are seeing refugees in refuge in Kansas, their journeys read like a slave escaped slave narratives. They read almost the same way. So people are basically having to flee by any means that they can, and a lot of them are getting whatever transportation getting across the Mississippi River, and some of them, in some cases, they're walking the rest of the way. In some cases, they're walking even to the Mississippi. They're by any way they can. And again, this is where that some of these slaves are 70 or 80 years old, as Booker T. Washington said. How are you going to manage that as a 70 or 80 years old? So I mean, just getting there, the challenge. But once you're there, the challenge is just beginning. So you've escaped the South. You have an opportunity to build on your own land. You're building your own Black communities here, autonomous, self-determination, independent. You don't have to worry about Jim Crow law in an all-Black town. What you do have to worry about is, what are you going to eat, right? And can you build a self-sustaining town from basically nothing? And that's why Nicodemus essentially was doomed. And this is the question. This is the problem. Again, this is more along the lines of what Booker T. Washington would advocate for. Don't worry about Jim Crow. Don't worry about the law. Just build your own towns, build your own stuff, build your own businesses and establishments, right? You don't have to worry about, Jim Crow law in your own Black towns. That's going to sort of, the arc of that story is going to bend towards Black nationalism. So you have Booker T. Washington, and then you have Marcus Garvey, who I'll get into in a later video, who was kind of a disciple of Booker T. Washington. And then Malcolm X, whose father was a Garveyite and was murdered while distributing Garveyite literature. That's the direction that arc sort of bends, whereas Booker T. Washington's arc sort of bends, whereas W.E.B. Du Bois's arc sort of bends more towards integration and making real this notion of citizenship. But the problem that you're going to face, and again, this is what I'm up in the classroom with my, I'm not here to tell you what ideology you should pursue. That would be, and I wouldn't presume to do that. What I do see my role is helping you understand, if you choose this route, this ideology, here are the things that you need to figure out. And one of those burning questions always pop up for Black nationalists is, how independent can you be? Can you really be completely independent and self-sustaining, right? You take San Diego, for example, where I'm at. Let's say that San Diego was decided they were their own autonomous Black town, right? Cool. Where are you going to get your water from? Currently, San Diego gets its water from the Colorado Aqueduct, and without that, San Diego would be screwed. So on some level, how much can you realistically extract yourself from the larger infrastructure? In the case of Nicodemus, the town was doomed when the railroads bypassed the town, because ultimately, you can only extract so much from the infrastructure. Right, so that's going to be a problem that Black nationalists are going to have to sort of address. In addition to that, we have Black Cowboys who went out west. Again, you don't have to deal with Jim Crow out there. There's hardly any law at all, and that can be both an advantage and a disadvantage, right? So basically you're on equal footing with everybody else, as long as you're a shooter. It's, the cattle drives, as we saw in the video, the major cattle drive ended at Dodge City in Kansas, famous kind of shoot 'em up, lawless city. But if you're Black, how's the law working for you? And is removing the law necessarily a disadvantage, right? As long as you got a 6-shooter, it's dangerous, but it's dangerous for everybody, not just you, right? So in that sense, lawlessness can be both an advantage and a disadvantage at the same time. But again, this is one of those things where it's not an option if you're like 70, 80 years old. Can you imagine doing these long cattle drives, as an elderly person? Those are options that you're going to have to weigh in deciding what you would do under those circumstances. So then we have also W.E.B. Du Bois, who was the W.E.B. Du Bois, who was the founder of the National Association for the Advancement of Colored People in 1909. He has a very different philosophy from Booker T. Washington, whereas Booker T. Washington is emphasizing self-determination, self-sufficiency, independence. Don't bother us white folks. We're not going to try to get in your schools. Just let us make our own schools. W.E.B. Du Bois and his philosophy was more keeping true to what you put on paper, as Martin Luther King said. You said we had citizenship, yet we're not able to enjoy the rights of a citizen. So the NAACP tended to attack Jim Crow laws, whereas that wasn't a problem for Booker T. Washington. Keep your Jim Crow laws. I'm not trying to sit at your lunch counter, right? For example, the NAACP, one of their first, they tend to be very legalistic in how they approach things. So one of the first things they did was to attack the grandfather clause. And by 1915, they had already to the Supreme Court and abolished the grandfather clause. But the problem with that is that always another law so it's not as if they abolished the grandfather clause and it's like, okay, cool, now we can vote. We'll just make another law. And then you have to challenge that one in court. So the advantage that Booker T. Washington had was that he wasn't worried about the law. He wasn't worried about Jim Crow. He wasn't worried about voting rights. As long as we had independence and autonomy in our own Black communities and self-determination, yeah, you can keep your Jim Crow. It's fine. Now, again, the disadvantage that Booker T. Washington had was where you're going to get your funding. And he found some creative ways to get into that in a later video. But W.E.B. Du Bois, whereas Nicodemus was more focused on self-determination, independence, autonomy, you had other opportunities for Black folks out West that were more aligned with where W.E.B. Du Bois was going as an integrationist. And this is where the Buffalo Soldiers came in. Now, again, we also have to understand that sharecroppers essentially spent a lifetime in debt, and it was deliberately manufactured that way, to where you bring in your crop and your expenses are always outweigh what's in your yield, and that was by design. So that meant that you were bound to service on that plantation for additional year to work off the debt, right? So that's why people bounced to places like Nicodemus. Other folks went and joined the military, as we saw in the video, the Reorganization Act, into the Buffalo Soldier regiments, the 9th and 10th Cavalry and the 24th and 25th Infantry. Now, they did that because to escape the South, right? To escape life as a sharecropper, $13 a month was not a great wage even at that time. It was a Black wage, but it wasn't a life of perpetual debt. Right. And you got food rations, you got clothes, you were able to make a living here. And this is why I want to be careful not to condemn their actions without understanding what their options were. Right. I mean, it's easy to say, I wouldn't join the army. I wouldn't go fight this white supremacist war. But imagine your options are that, or either A, sharecropping, or B, prison convict labor, because there are ways in which it was very easy. It was almost existing while black was a crime at that time that could get you leased out as a convict later. So there was almost no way to avoid it. So we have to weigh that. Getting back to W.E.B. Du Bois's sort of ideology, there were black folks who joined the military with the idea that this was their pathway to citizenship. If they fought for this country, if they volunteered in America's wars and sacrificed, that they would be embraced as citizens. They believed that, and W.E.B. Du Bois believed that for a while. I mean, he became disillusioned after a little while, but one of the things he did when Woodrow Wilson was president was he issued this sort of closed ranks speech, urging black folks to close ranks behind Woodrow Wilson during World War I, in what Woodrow Wilson referred to as a war to make the world safe for democracy. A war to make the world safe for democracy. So W.E.B. Du Bois is looking at like, okay, yeah, sounds good. I'll take some of that. Yeah, sign me up. Let me fight for this war to make the world safe for democracy. And maybe I'll be able to enjoy the rights as a citizen if we do. It didn't work out that way, right? And that's a trap that a lot of black folks are going to fall in, even during World War II, especially during World War II, where you had the W.E.B campaign, victory abroad, victory at home. Here we are fighting Hitler and Nazism and white supremacy. This is our time, right? Folks are signing up for this war, getting behind the cause against white supremacy, thinking that it's going to extinguish white supremacy. Victory abroad, W.E.B campaign, victory abroad, victory at home. Got the victory abroad, still waiting on that victory at home, right? So this is one of those dilemmas that black folks are going to face. And again, if you want to check out the video in the description below on black folks who fought during the Philippine War, they were confronted with that contradiction head on, because here you had openly folks white soldiers who were flying under this banner of manifest destiny and white supremacy. It's our duty to conquer these Filipinos in order to uplift them and civilize them. And these black folks are fighting alongside white soldiers, saying, where have I heard this before? And so a number of them actually ended up deserting and joining the Philippine resistance against white supremacy, right? Not so much during the Native American Wars, but that did happen during the Philippine Wars. And this was a real dilemma that they were facing. Is it really in my interest to gain entry into this club? If doing so requires me to under a banner of white supremacy. Am I going to be let into this club? That's a tough one. And again, it's easy to say, I wouldn't do that, but while we have to be real about that they were on the wrong side of this war on white supremacy, we also have to understand that their options were limited. So that's really all I wanted to kind of clear up with with this presentation, and I'll be posting the actual video a little bit later on. I do have some time for questions, and if you're feeling generous, super chats would be super appreciated. Again, that would help me to make this material even more accessible to the masses. But I'll take just other questions as well if you have questions or comments. I'm genuinely, when I ask what would you do, I don't ask that as if I have a good answer to that question. Honestly, I don't, because again, these are hard choices that people are confronting. And so that's why I don't disparage the Buffalo Soldiers, but again, we do have to be real about what role they played. We do have a comment from Eddie Willis. Thank you, Eddie, for commenting. Many of us are comfortably in the matrix performing meritorious manumission daily in hopes of acceptance from the dominant society. Yeah. And I get it. Even as recently as 9/11, you know, when the spotlight on Arabs and Muslims, there was a lot of black people going, right? But that's not going to come back and bite us. We always, no matter who white supremacy is directed at, we always have to stand against it because it's always going to come back and bite us. It might be in Muslims today, but if we don't challenge it, it's going to be us tomorrow. And I think that's one of the lessons that we need to take away from the Buffalo Soldiers. I mean, again, I get why they did what they did. I don't disparage them for that, but we got to learn the lessons. So thank you, Eddie, for your comment. I appreciate it. Yes, and it's a good insight. And again, I'm looking for insights because again, I don't pose these questions pretending that I have good answers to them myself. I don't know what I would have done if given those options at that particular time. So I'm not trying to play holier than thou. But in any case, I'll wait a little while for if anybody else has comments or questions. I do appreciate your joining me. I will be posting this. The video will post in about 15 minutes on my channel if you want to refer to it. And this portion would be just the Q&A part of it. The question, question from Eddie Willis: should we prepare for all-out war, continue to keep hope alive through the current political structure to focus on the former structure will focus on the former slaves of the Americas? I always avoid saying, even when I'm in the classroom, I always avoid saying, here's what we should do, right? Here's what we should, here's the approach that we should take. I have my ideas, but I don't want to poison the well. You know, whether you follow Washington or whether you follow W.E.B. Du Bois, my thing is be aware that there are some advantages. Booker T. Washington, you don't have to worry about Jim Crow laws. You do have to worry about what you're going to build your schools with, right? How are you going to solve that problem, right? Whereas W.E.B. Du Bois is trying to get connected to the resources, tackle the Jim Crow laws, etc. His problem is, yeah, you tackled that law, but they're just going to make another one, right? So as long as you're aware and understand what the parameters are, I'm not here to tell you here's what you should do. Again, it's in terms of preparing for all-out war. You could do that. Understand that you're going up against the most powerful military the world has ever seen. So I mean, yeah, you can get armed and you can get the guns. They got tanks, you know. So and even the police, you know, the thing about that we've been talking about in terms of the militarization of the police, you know, we saw that in Ferguson, Missouri. Where we had all these military hand-me-downs and the police were using military grade gear against a civilian population. All-out war against a nuclear power. I mean, I don't know how you're gonna to do that. Yeah, Eddie, again, I appreciate your comments. Thank you. Keep coming. No reparative justice, no reparations, no vote. Yeah, that's another thing that we need to have a conversation about. How do we so in terms of reparations, the root of that is to repair. How do we repair the damage that's been done? And there's a lot of different ways that you can do that. As far as the vote, I'm in a privileged position where I'm in California. So if I don't vote for Biden, so given the given the landscape of the electoral college, it doesn't, as long as the Democrats get more than 50% of the vote, it doesn't, anything over 50%, it doesn't matter if they get 51% or if they get 99%, they're still going to get the same number of electoral votes. So that gave me the luxury of being able to take a principled stance and say, no, I'm not voting for Biden. I know that choice isn't going to result in Trump becoming the president. So that's why I can do that. There's no way Trump was going to win California, no matter what. If I voted for Biden or not, he's going to get the same number of electoral votes. So that's as undemocratic as that is. That's the one advantage of the electoral college, is that I can actually vote or not vote my conscience and not have that lead to another 4 years of Trump, or at least not be responsible for that. What the other state is. But again, there's different ways of looking at that too. And I get both sides of this. I get people who would take a principled stand, even in places like, Ohio, or swing states like Michigan or Indiana or whatever, that didn't vote for Biden. I would have a hard time doing that in one of those states, and I don't, again, know what I would do. But another way that is not to look at it as if you're voting for a candidate, but if you're an organizer, if you are an activist, the question becomes, which landscape would I rather do activist work under, right? So voting for a Biden or even voting for an Obama doesn't mean that you love them as a candidate. What it might mean is that you would rather organize under them than the alternative. So that's one thing to keep in mind. And I just put these things out there. I try to folks what they do with them as far as, but I do get that stance. I'm not saying don't do that. But again, understand what the consequences of that might be. And as long as you're okay with the outcomes, as long as you carefully consider that, it's not for me to tell you that's the wrong or right approach. And I just won't do. I really, my students ask me that all the time, and I really I was like, I can't do it. I don't want to poison the well. I don't want to. This is your process, and I want you. My role is to just open your eyes to, here's the consequences if you choose that route, and either route you choose is going to have consequences. It's just a question of which set of consequences am I comfortable living in, and that's for you to decide, really. But thank you so much. I've got to go see my son, but I really appreciate you all who've stuck with us and joined us. Do consider subscribing, and I'm not able to post as regularly as I'd like to, because I do teach. So the content's going to come out somewhat radically. So hit that subscribe button, hit the notification so that you're notified when new content drops. I really appreciate these discussions. I get a lot out of them, so I appreciate your participation in them, in these discussions. And until I can post again, I'll see you in the